It's a pleasure to be at the bookstall, and thank you all for coming. So the story of how this book came about began 6 years ago for me when I read a sentence that changed my life. I was reading the memoirs of a Russian singer who was very popular at the end of the First World War in Russia. His name was Alexander Vertinsky. And then he was popular in Western Europe after he emigrated. And he described how in 1920 he escaped from the Bolsheviks in the south of Russia and landed in Constantinople, which is what Istanbul used to be called. And then he wrote the following sentence, which I'll translate for you from the Russian. "I began to perform," he said, "in the outdoor entertainment garden of our famous Moscow Negro, Fyodor Fyodorovich Thomas, the owner of the famous Maxim in Moscow." Now, this so surprised me that I closed the book and put it down. I'd studied this period in Russian history and culture. I knew something about it. I had never heard of any kind of a famous black person in Russia at this time. In fact, to this day, if you ask a reasonably educated Russian person to name the most famous black person in Russian imperial history prior to 1917, it's almost certain that they will say it was Abram Hannibal, who is famous because he's the great-great-grandfather of Russia's national writer, Alexander Pushkin, but he lived in the earlier part of the 18th century. In other words, there were no other famous black people, whether from Africa directly, the Caribbean, or the United States, who lived in Russia prior to 1917. The famous trips by representatives of the Harlem Renaissance, people like Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson later on, that was all in the Soviet period. So I was intrigued, and like anybody who finds some curious new fact that they want to learn more about, I began by Googling it. Nothing came up. So I used a Russian search engine, and what came up was the same sentence from Vertinsky that had started me off. But by then I was intrigued, and so I spent several months digging through Yale University's vast libraries, and I came up with very little. And what little I came up with was very contradictory. But by then I was hooked. I also had a wonderful gift awaiting me, which was a year-long sabbatical. And I decided to spend all of it trying to figure out who this enigmatic man was. So I wound up doing research during that year in various places in the United States, especially the National Archives in and outside of Washington, D.C. I went to Russia, I went to France, to England, to Turkey, and via proxy, I had people help me begin to look in places as far-flung as Buenos Aires and Rotterdam. Had they found any sign of documents of interest to me, I would have been on the first flight out. And at the end of the year, I had pulled together a surprising amount of information, which allowed me to write the book that I'm telling you about. So this man, known in Russia as Fyodor Fyodorovich Thomas, was actually an American named Frederick Bruce Thomas. He was born in Coahoma County, Mississippi, which is part of the Delta, in 1872. The Delta is a famous and a notorious place in American history. It's been called the most southern place on earth because it embodies all of the most striking features, good and bad, of the old and post-Civil War South. And it's clear to me that my subject, Frederick, got his wings in life from his parents, who were remarkable people. They had been slaves until emancipation. And then in 1869, 4 years after the Civil War ended, they did something absolutely remarkable for a black family in that part of the South at that time. They managed to buy at auction a 200-acre plot of land, including farmland, for the price of $20. Moreover, they had 3 years to pay off the money in installments, which meant that 6 2/3 during the first year and some change was all that they had to spend. Now, within a year of buying this piece of property, they were registered in the 1870 census as having property and crops that were worth $5,000 in 1870 currency. So in other words, they had multiplied their initial investment hundreds of times over. And as a result, they became members of a tiny black elite in that part of the South, because out of some 250 farms that existed in that particular county in 1870, only 6 belonged to black families, and theirs was the second biggest one at 200 acres. Over the next dozen plus years, they increased their holdings to over 600 acres, which made them into an even more elite land-holding black family. Another triumph that I think had a strong influence on their son, Frederick, later, and he was born on that farm in 1872, was that the Thomas parents showed a great commitment to their local black community. A decade after they bought the land, they founded on it a local African Methodist Episcopal Church. This is very likely only the second black AME church in this county ever established, after the mother church in a river town on the Mississippi. And I think the kind of commitment that this shows toward the local black community is a very telling trait that Frederick Thomas learned from his parents. Now, another important consequence of this is that, as you probably know, traditionally black Southern churches were not merely places of worship. They were also social and political gathering places, and most importantly, they were frequently the local schools for black children. And that's where Frederick got the rudiments of his education, most likely from his stepmother, who was also a remarkable black woman because she was literate, as well as showing remarkable character down the road, which I'll describe in a minute. The net result was that this family was very prominent, and this was not a good thing to be after Reconstruction ended in the South and the white power structure reasserted its authority. What happened to the Thomases is that in 1886, a local white planter, a very rich man with thousands of acres in his possession, resented the fact that this black family had become successful and concocted a plan to steal their farm from them. The parents were trusting and they acquiesced at first, but then they showed remarkable character because they realized that he was actually trying to cheat them via an elaborate ruse, and they took him to court. And then even more remarkable is that they won the case in the local chancery court. Now, this was not simply because the white judicial system in Coahoma in 1886 was prepared to defend truth and beauty automatically. It was because their lawyer happened to be a political opponent of the white planter's lawyer, and there were scores being settled that way. But the net result was that a completely unexpected verdict had been handed down, and so the white planter, who was trying to steal the land and lost on a local level, appealed to the Mississippi State Supreme Court, where the case then dragged on for a good half-dozen years and went through all kinds of complications. By now, it's 1890 in my story. Mississippi has become the lynchingest state in the South, which means in the Union. And so the Thomas family decided to get out of harm's way, even before the case was fully resolved. So they moved to Memphis, which is some 70 miles away, far enough away to be relatively safe, close enough to be able to keep track of the legal process. And that's where Frederick Thomas, got some more formal education. He went to a school for black youth, excuse me, that had been founded by Northerners and built on the rudiments that he had acquired in Coahoma County. But that's also where the second tragedy hit the family. And Frederick's father, Lewis, was murdered in a very brutal fashion in a way that I could describe to you in more detail, but that would be a spoiler, and I want you to read the book, so I think I'll leave those details out. And that marks the beginning of Frederick's independent life, which can be traced through 4 segments of his life later. And each of those segments is marked by a completely original move on his part. He broke the mold for black youth, for black Americans, with every step that he took. So in 1890, he decided to go north to seek employment in cities. This was decades before the Great Migration began, which really began only in earnest after the First